Angles. NBC's Pentagon correspondent Hans Nichols is in Washington. MSNBC's Garrett Haake is at the White House. Also with me, MSNBC military analyst and retired Army Colonel Jack Jacobs. Robert Kelly is associate professor of international relations at Pusan National University in South Korea. Good to see all of you, Garrett. The White House has repeatedly said it's run out of patience with North Korea, that the continual testing of ballistic missiles is unacceptable. So now what?
They've run out of patience, but most of their options are bad, and you can see reflected in the president's response last night the need for there to be a regional response to this. The president taking to Twitter last night for what has so far been the White House's only public comment on this. In his statements, the president says North Korea has just launched another missile. Does this guy have anything better to do with his life? Presumably referring to the North Korean dictator. Hard to believe that South Korea and Japan will put up with this much longer. Perhaps China will put a heavy move on North Korea and end this nonsense once and for all. Chris, the tweets reflecting the president's belief that it is China that will ultimately have to do more to put pressure on North Korea, the Chinese being their closest allies. This is something that the president has spoken to the president of China about as recently as Sunday, making phone calls in advance of the G20 summit, where he's expected to bring this issue up again in person with the leaders of all three of those countries who are most closely affected by this launch.
Hans, some have described this launch as a milestone for the North Korean nuclear program. How's it different from what we've seen before?
It flew 7 minutes longer than the May 14 test. And what Pentagon officials are looking at is the distance in the air, because with this missile, as well as the one they did in May 14, they basically shot it straight up in the air. Now, it only traveled some 500 miles, this one just a few hours ago. But when you tease that out and you give it a theoretical range, you get in the 4,000-mile range. Now, the missile that they sent up went almost 1,700 miles up in the air. We don't know whether or not its warhead, whether or not it had any sort of theoretical warhead, whether or not that survived re-entry. But this missile puts Alaska in range, and that's a big concern at the Pentagon.
Argument can be made, Colonel, the options available for this White House aren't all not very good. You can do nothing. You can try to negotiate, try to add more pressure, or military action. Here's how former DOD Chief of Staff Jeremy Bash described that scenario. Take a listen.
The options on the table for America are very limited, and one of the things I think the Trump administration is really weighing is preemptive military action. If they see another missile launched on a launch pad or on the back of a wheeled vehicle, as we saw in the images today, the Trump administration will have to decide whether to strike that preemptively. But of course, that could spark a wider war on the Korean Peninsula.
Colonel, what do you think is the most likely next step?
I think it's to squeeze China. China's the linchpin. Anything we can do to get China to put some pressure on North Korea is going to be termed much less scary than any kind of preemptive action. I think we're working very, very hard with China to try to squeeze some banks, but thus far, China doesn't want to see any kind of dislocations on the Korean Peninsula. They're happy with the status quo because everything else is much, much worse. I think you're going to see some cyber attacks, perhaps, by the United States. We're pretty good at cyber attacks on the offensive, not too good on the defensive, but we might try something there. The North Koreans would love to sit down and talk with the United States one-on-one. We're not going to do that. We want China and maybe even Japan, the Philippines involved as well. So thus far, I think military action is unlikely. We've got about 30,000 U.S. troops within artillery range of the North Korean border. We're not going to endanger them, I don't think.
Professor Kelly, in that one tweet, the president mentioned South Korea, Japan, and China. Where do you see these meetings going and the importance of these meetings at the G20 that's coming up?
Sure. I think the G20 is the most important venue for pushing North Korea because you need the G20 states to cooperate if the sanctions are going to work. And the sanctions are the most likely way to peacefully resolve this. As your previous guest said, as Colonel Jacobs said, military action against North Korea has enormous risks. There'd be human shields. The North Koreans might launch against a local opponent like Japan or South Korea. The risks are gigantic, and so the likelihood is that we will continue to push for sanctions. And the best way to do that is to work through a large organization like the G20 that represents so much of the world economy, because those are the people you need to shut the gate into North Korea, and that means China above all. This whole thing is about China.
In the meantime, Garrett, you have a president who had made it very clear that his patience was running out even before you had the American student Otto Warmbier, who, of course, as everyone knows, came back to the United States and died shortly after. He expressed how angry he was about that. Is there any sense from the people you're talking to at the White House that this has changed the equation in any way in terms of the president's patience?
Well, Chris, I'm glad you mentioned Otto Warmbier because it's important to remember that none of this happens in a vacuum. The president was already furious at the North Koreans for the way that situation played out. And remember, it was on the eve of his first meeting with the Chinese president that we had another North Korean missile launch a few months ago. So there's a sense of a developing trend here of North Korea stepping on the president's toes, trying to be involved in these big, on the eve of these big multilateral, these big foreign events. So far, the president's made very clear they don't want to telegraph what they're going to do. They like the idea of being sort of strategically unpredictable here. But again, so far, the line from the White House has been on all of these North Korea issues that the era of strategic patience is over. But we don't know what the follow-up's going to be. So we haven't seen that second step yet, and the White House is perfectly happy to leave that unspoken until they make a more concrete decision.
Yeah, Professor Kelly, do you see more patience here? Do you think that the president and the international community, for that matter, can sort of wait this out and see where North Korea goes next?
Well, I do think patience is sort of what will happen because the military options are so terrible, and we've been trying to do sanctions against North Korea for such a long time. It's just not clear how many more moves we have on the outside. And like I said, I think a lot of this comes back to China's willingness to sanction North Korea or not. So strategic patience, I mean, you can sort of say that it's a terrible title and people don't like it, but I mean, that continues to be what we're doing. It continues to be conventional deterrence and containment of North Korea, trying to prevent them from doing these things, slow them down as much as possible. But it's not clear what the other big options are, because if there were any great options, they would have been chosen or tried a long time ago.
But how close are we getting to the point, Colonel, that the U.S. Has to say, we can't wait anymore, we have to make a decisive move here?
Well, some people say we've long passed that point. We've kicked this can down the road, we and China both, for a long, long time, decades. A series of administrations has ignored the problem until now. We're at a position where we either have to ignore the next step, which is the capability of North Korea to mount a miniaturized nuclear weapon atop an intercontinental ballistic missile, or take some decisive action. I think that the next thing to do, or that we're going to try to do, is, as I said, probably use cyber means to disable or make it extremely difficult for them to continue their research. But at the end of the day, squeezing China is absolutely the way to go, and I think we're going to keep working on that. Don't forget, we just sent a guided missile destroyer down to the contested Paracel Islands, which China has claimed as its own. We just sent about $1.5 billion worth of military hardware to Taiwan, and we're now talking about leaning on China still further by limiting imports of Chinese steel, and we import a lot of that. Lots more left to do, but quite frankly, not a whole lot of time to do it. A lot of people estimate that it's only 12, 18, maybe 24 months before North Korea has the capability to mount a nuclear weapon on an ICBM.
And as the U.S. takes these actions, Hans, that Jack just laid out, and obviously continues to consider what else they might do, what else China might do, the Pentagon is always ready for the possibility, right? Am I correct in saying that the president might make a decision that could surprise everyone and say we need to take some sort of military action here?
Yeah, just because the Pentagon has options and they're always planning for options, planning for contingencies, doesn't mean that there's been the strategic sort of decision made to launch those options. So when you ask Pentagon officials about options for North Korea, they give you sort of a standard response saying, we always have options. Just what those options are and how close the president is to receiving advice from the Joint Staff, from Secretary Mattis, we don't have an answer to that. And I think that's by design, because they want to keep everyone guessing. Just real quickly on these navigation moves, these freedom of navigation operations where they sail a destroyer somewhere in the South China Sea. The Chinese get very upset with this, but the international view on this is that these sorts of maneuvers, they're called FONs, FONs, freedom of navigations, they shouldn't make an outrage. They are really just tactical decisions on where to sail an ocean and sail a ship international waters. What the U.S. officials say and what U.S. side says is this isn't even an issue. We're in international waters, and the fact that China protests, that should not be a major thing, because really what we're just doing is following international regulations. Guys?
And Professor, I can't let you go because some people may recognize you from that now famous video where you were doing an interview with, I think it was a BBC interview, and your kids came out, who we all immediately fell in love with. How have they and how have you handled your 15 minutes of fame?
Yeah, it's been pretty strange. For a while there, people were like following us around, and we had to turn off our phones for a week or so. We had to do that big press conference. It's faded a little bit. We still do get phone calls, and people still do remember it. So I go to speak or about Korea or something, and the first 5 questions in the Q&A are actually about my kids, not about North Korea's weapons or something.
Well,
but, it's calmed
I'd
down.
like to think we're a serious organization. We don't ask it till the end.
That's right. Thank you. They're fine. They're both growing.
I do appreciate your being with us today. Hans Nichols as well, Garrett Haake, Colonel Jacobs, and Professor Kelly. Thanks to you all for your insight.